From Berlin's high-stakes diplomacy to The Hague's reparations blueprint, Europe is racing to lock in a peace that may demand painful choices. Zelensky vows no land for peace, yet signals readiness to drop Ukraine's NATO dream for ironclad US-backed security guarantees. Western powers push a European-led force and the seizure of frozen Russian assets. Bold moves met with Moscow's silence and firm rejection of foreign troops. As Trump-era envoys claim 90% progress, the core dilemma remains: can peace be built on principle, or will realpolitik force Kyiv towards concessions that challenge its sovereignty and the West's credibility? I'm Henry Saif. This is Think Tank.
Our world is becoming unhinged.
The Guardian has reported that a breakthrough in Berlin has resolved 90% of the friction between Kyiv and Washington. President Zelensky confirms that 5 key security documents mirroring NATO-style protection will be ready for the Kremlin within days. The US Congress is now expected to vote on these binding guarantees to ensure long-term stability. However, the last 10% remains a major hurdle. While the US proposes a free economic zone in Donbass, Ukraine refuses to recognize any Russian control. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz expressed rare optimism, suggesting peace is closer than ever, despite the difficult territorial compromises ahead. The true test begins this weekend, when US envoys present these terms to Vladimir Putin. If Moscow rejects the deal, Zelensky warns of turbulence, calling for even tougher sanctions and more weapons. For now, the world watches to see if diplomacy can finally silence the guns. And according to the Kyiv Independent, European leaders convene in Brussels tomorrow for a high-stakes summit to decide the fate of a €210 billion reparations loan for Ukraine. Backed by frozen Russian central bank assets, this plan is Kyiv's primary lifeline as it faces a potential cash depletion by spring 2026. President Zelensky's office warns that a failure to act would be a catastrophe for all of Europe, signaling a collapse of continental solidarity. While German Chancellor Friedrich Merz strongly supports the move, internal divisions persist. Belgium, home to the majority of these assets, fears legal repercussions, while Hungary and Slovakia remain potential spoilers. To bypass a certain veto, the EU recently utilized an emergency indefinite freeze on Russian funds, framing the issue as a matter of strategic agency and self-defense against future aggression.
Talks on ending the Russia-Ukraine war took center stage in Berlin during 2 days of high-stakes diplomacy as momentum builds toward a possible peace deal. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held intensive discussions with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, US envoys, and top European leaders, with one issue dominating the agenda: security guarantees strong enough to prevent future Russian attacks. Among those involved were European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, representing US President Donald Trump's circle. While Zelensky described the talks as difficult, he said they were productive and confirmed progress with U.S. negotiators. European leaders emerged with their most detailed commitments yet. In a joint statement, they pledged sustained military, intelligence, logistical, economic, and diplomatic support for Ukraine. Key proposals includes a European-led multinational force on Ukrainian soil, backed by the United States, alongside plans for a peacetime Ukrainian military of around 800,000 troops. President Trump added to the optimism, saying an agreement to end the war is closer now than we have ever been, praising Europe's tremendous support and confirming multiple conversations with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Despite the progress, major issues remain unresolved, including the future of Russian-occupied territories and how U.S. security guarantees would function in practice. European leaders emphasized that any territorial decisions belong solely to the Ukrainian people and only after firm security guarantees are in place. For now, the Berlin talks have brought unity and cautious optimism, but the most difficult decisions still lie ahead.
To shed more light on this file, we're joined from Kyiv by Mr. Peter Dickinson, the expert at the Atlas Center for Studies, and from Washington by Mr. Mark Toth, the national security and foreign policy expert. Gentlemen, welcome to Think Tank. Mr. Dickinson, Zelensky says no land for peace, yet he's ready to drop NATO for U.S. security guarantees. So can Ukraine really afford such a trade-off without technically surrendering its future?
Yeah, absolutely. NATO has always been about security guarantees for Ukraine. That's been the case going back to the start of Russia's invasion in 2014. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, public support for NATO membership was minimal. It was, I believe, around 15%. It was certainly consistently lower than 20%. So it was a very marginal issue. There was no real groundswell of interest or support for NATO. Of course, that's grown over the last 11 years as Russian aggression has escalated. All of a sudden, it's become a matter of national survival to get those security guarantees that come with NATO membership. But if Ukraine can get those security guarantees by another form, as is now being suggested, then the issue of NATO is redundant. Of course, there is a sense that that is the most reliable security guarantee of all. But if we have security guarantees that are ratified by the US Congress, for example, and other participating countries, so presumably we're talking here about the Brits, perhaps the Germans and French, some other participating countries, but first and foremost the Americans, if they ratify clear and unambiguous security guarantees of a NATO style as they're being framed now, then I think that's absolutely doable for Ukraine. That will be fine. The territorial side of things is perhaps more complex. Ukraine has already made a huge concession by saying they'll basically accept Russia's continued occupation of all the areas that are currently held by the Kremlin. So that's around 20% of Ukrainian territory. What they won't do is surrender the remaining areas in East Ukraine that the Ukrainian government still holds in the Donetsk region of the Donbass, which is quite a small territory, geographically speaking, but it's also home to Ukraine's most important fortifications. So it's really a very, very important strategic area that Ukraine will want to hold on to at all costs as a barrier to further Russian attacks. So that's going to be a big sticking point. But if they can get the security guarantees, they say, if they're NATO standard, if they're on the par with NATO, the issue of NATO membership is really a moot point for Ukrainians.
Yes. Well, Mr. Toth, are these NATO-like guarantees a credible shield? Will they stand the test of time, or do you see them as a Trump-era exit ramp from a war the U.S. no longer wants to fund?
Henny, greetings to you, your viewers, and to Mr. Nicholson. Look, I think it's still problematic. Anytime that you say NATO-like, that means NATO forces are not going to be inside a post-war Ukraine. And the way that NATO works as an organization is that you have different trigger points, discussions or outright invocation of Article 5 That takes time because each member state then can decide how they want to react on their own. Oftentimes, Article 5 is misunderstood to be some kind of automatic trigger. It's not. It's an automatic trigger in the sense of it heightens the issue, but there's still a lot of debate to be had in terms of how a fellow NATO country comes to the aid of another. That said, as well, given that for these security guarantees that are being talked about in the media, to have U.S. Senate confirmation of them, that's going to be problematic as well. Because say you do reach a ceasefire, how long is that going to take to get through that legislation, to get through the U.S. Senate, and for any given treaty to be signed and enacted into law? That brings up the question: what happens if Putin attacks again during that gray period, where those security guarantees aren't as ironclad as any of us would like them to be? So, my concern here is that there's a lot of talk about security guarantees, but we've not seen enough structure about how they'd come save the Europeans leading that force. Now, having said that, the problem that you run into there is, while it's admirable that in Berlin, the French and the British and the Germans have said they want a multinational force on the ground that has multi-domain capabilities in terms of military capabilities. That's admirable, but that's a red line for Putin. So I fear that while we're 90% there, the 10%, as Mr. Nicholson said, about the Donbas territory, which Ukraine gives that up, that's committing national suicide essentially on the battlefield. That 10% tells me we're not anywhere close to peace at this point.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the battlefield, Mr. Dickinson, now Ukraine is reportedly controlling 90% of Kupiansk. So is Kiev gaining battlefield leverage just as peace talks demand territorial concessions?
Well, the situation in Kupiansk is certainly a very interesting one. And the trend that we've been witnessing for the last year and a half, I would say, has been very, very small and slow, but nevertheless steady Russian advances. So the Russians have been creeping forward at various points along the front lines and have been gaining ground. Now, as I say, that's been a slow process, and overall, the amount of land gained is pretty small itself. It's around 0.5%, less than 1%, certainly, of Ukraine since the summer of 2024. So it's certainly not a decisive breakthrough, but nevertheless, the battlefield initiative has clearly been with the Russians. They've been pushing forward. What we've seen recently has been probably Ukraine's biggest advances or biggest success on the battlefield in some time, in the city of Kupiansk, which is a strategically important city in northeast Ukraine. It's a logistics hub on the border between the Kharkiv and Lugansk regions, very close to the Russian border as well, in fact. And the Russians had been pushing there. This city was occupied by the Russians at the start of the full-scale invasion. It was then retaken and liberated by Ukraine in the September 2022 counteroffensive. And then Russia, as it's been advancing in the last year and a half, has been creeping toward Kupiansk. And over the since late October through till December, there have been a number of announcements coming from the Kremlin, including from Putin himself, saying, we've got Kupiansk, we've retaken the city, it's ours. We're essentially just involved in mopping up operations. Putin even invited journalists to come and witness the Russian victory. And then Zelensky pulled a rather bold move just a few days ago. He actually personally went to Kupiansk, took a selfie video there, standing at the entrance to the city, and said, "Look, Putin's lying. Basically, he's telling lies about Russian gains. He's trying to paint a picture of inevitable Russian victory here. In fact, it's not the case. We hold Kupiansk. We're gaining ground." And so it was a very big propaganda victory, I would say, information victory for Zelensky. It was very embarrassing for Putin, but also it underlined that, Ukraine had regained territory there. At the moment, we hear that they've almost completely regained control over that city. Now, of course, that can change again. There's nothing to suggest that Russia won't push back again. But certainly it was a reminder that it's not one-way traffic. The Ukrainians are still a formidable fighting force. They can still fight back and they can still win, at least at a local level. So the narrative being promoted by the Kremlin, and I think very heavily pushed with the Trump administration, this idea that Russian victory is inevitable, is not entirely true. And Ukraine is certainly working hard to undermine that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Toth, Trump keeps praising Putin and sidelining Europe in the early talks. So is Washington brokering peace, or is it paving the way for a US-Russia détente at Ukraine's expense?
Yeah, look, I think Trump wants to get on to different affairs around the world. He's focused on the Indo-Pacific. His new national security strategy that was released 2 weeks ago focuses on the Western Hemisphere. You're seeing that in the news headlines in terms of Venezuela, the ratcheting up of threats against the Maduro regime. You've got the largest U.S. buildup of forces in the Caribbean since 1962, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Trump wants to move on. But the problem is the approach that he's taking, in my opinion, with Europe is that he's not understanding that Putin has no intention of striking a peace deal. We keep going through this kabuki theater day after day in which everyone talks about peace. But the reality is, look, the peace that Trump wants is more business-centric and more, let me focus on other hemispheres at the expense of Europe. The peace for Zelensky is simply national survival, making sure that Ukrainian sovereignty continues to exist, as well as their own unique national identity. For Putin, it's just cosmetic gamesmanship here, where he really views peace as just a way to continue waging war against Ukraine. And if you look at that, if you step back from that in terms of what Trump is faced with here, and the reality that Trump needs to come to is look at how much Putin's narratives have changed over time for the justification of his war. He's gone off on long diatribes about how mythical Kyiv and Rus was one of the reasons that he had to invade Ukraine so as to restore historical Russian territories. He's argued about the denazification of Kyiv as if that existed, but it doesn't. He's argued that, oh, NATO caused all of this. That's why I had to do it, despite, Finland and Sweden acceding during this term. Now the latest, amidst all of these peace negotiations, you have Lavrov out there saying, look, Russia is telling Europe, he wants to dictate this to Europe and the United States, that we now have to return to Europe as it was in 1997, which would mean countries like Poland, Romania, the Baltic states, Finland and Sweden too, would no longer be part of NATO. So if you keep giving this guy a cookie, as we say to our kids in bedtime stories here in the U.S., he's just going to keep asking for more. And now with the latest, he's asking for NATO. Peace isn't close here. This is just all kabuki theater.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Dickinson, being in Kiev, how would you say the Ukrainian public opinion is reacting to the idea of a free economic zone in Donbass? Does it feel like compromise or capitulation?
I think it's not. I don't think anybody takes the idea seriously, to be honest. I think the notion that there could be an area that's under Russian control but not under Russian military control is just disregarded as completely absurd. The Ukrainians understand that if they were to surrender this area of the Donbass that is in question, that would be some form, that is the most fortified part of Ukraine's national defences. It would be a catastrophic decision for any Ukrainian leader. I don't think that any Ukrainian leader could expect to survive that. That government would fall. That president would certainly be removed. And there's a very good chance that the military itself would simply refuse to obey such orders. They would simply refuse to withdraw. I think that's also a very realistic scenario if they were to attempt that. But the idea itself is just seen as a non-starter. It's not taken seriously, and it's seen as a symbol, I suppose, of how unseriously Russia is taking these talks, and perhaps how the Americans also. I would agree that what we're seeing now is really a sort of imitation of peace talks. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians are eager not to be the obstacle to peace, so they're trying to avoid. There's a blame game going on. They're all trying to avoid the blame and trying to avoid responsibility because they fear that would somehow provoke a response from Trump, a negative response from Trump, one way or the other. So they're eager not to appear to be the party that is responsible for obstructing peace. But there's very little indication that Russia has any real interest in ending the war. On the contrary, I think if we listen to what the Russians are saying, what Putin and all of the other senior Kremlin officials are saying in recent weeks, it's very clear that they have no interest in compromise. They're ready to push on with the most extreme form of their sort of maximalist demands, which for Ukraine means an end of statehood. It means it means the erasure of the Ukrainian state, and most likely the erasure of the Ukrainian nation as a national identity. So they are very clear that there's no real room for compromise there between Ukraine's national survival and Russia's goals. So yeah, economic zones and so on really don't cut it, and I've not heard anyone discuss it in any serious sense.
Mr. Toth, as you've mentioned before, the US claims that 90% of the peace plan is agreed upon, yet Donbass remains the last 10%. It seems to be the biggest or one of the main sticking points. So is that gap unbridgeable, or is Washington pressuring Kiev to bend over?
Look, I think at this point it's unbridgeable. And when you consider the Donbass, and maybe for viewers, picture a Ukrainian fist punching deep into the eastern part of Ukraine. That fist is key. And if you were to look at battle maps and assessing the different theaters of operations that are occurring, you'll see that the Russians, as far north as Sumy, which is really more or less a stalemate at that point, but also cities like Kyiv, things like Kupiansk, further south towards Pokrovsk, you see the Russian supporting efforts in this war trying to break through those lines. They can't. Without that fist there, if they somehow were to concede that, no matter what you call it nomenclature-wise, if you call it an economic zone, there's just a bunch of gobbledygook nonsense to try to soften it, the verbiage of it. But the reality is, if suddenly the U.S., somehow forced Ukraine, which I agree with Mr. Nicholson, that's just not going to happen, to withdraw from those defensive belts there, the Russians would have a lot of different options. They could sweep up towards Kharkiv. They could sweep downward towards Zaporizhia. They would have, an easier way of getting to Kyiv. They could threaten the key Black Sea port of Odessa. It makes no sense. I don't know one serious military general that's commanded like U.S. Army Europe, someone like General Ben Hodges, who would argue that Ukraine should give that up. It would be, military suicide. And I'd also point out that, look, if Europe is going to indeed at some point provide security guarantees, and the U.S. too, if it ever becomes kinetic, this would be like sacrificing this rookie gap between Poland and Lithuania. Why would you, as the U.S., as Europe, as a multinational force guaranteeing this, why would you want that zone to be demilitarized in favor of Russia? It makes no military sense whatsoever for the West, and it makes no military sense whatsoever for Ukraine.
Well, Mr. Dickinson, militarily, can European-led troops on Ukrainian soil replace a NATO membership option, or is this just a temporary fix that leaves Kiev exposed on the long term?
Well, I mean, when we talk about security guarantees in general, whether it be NATO standard guarantees or the coalition of the willing or whatever formulas you want to come up with, you always come back to the same fundamental point, the same key question: are these other countries prepared to fight Russia on Ukraine's behalf? And I would suggest the answer is obvious, and it's a resounding no, they're not. So then that raises a lot of very, very awkward questions about, what can they realistically do? I think that the most effective use of foreign troops in Ukraine would probably be in terms of managing some sort of logistical role, in terms of providing training and support and maintenance and so on. That could be realistic. But then we come back to the fundamental again of whether Russia will accept that. And I think Russia's been very clear they will not accept that. Russia has been consistent in saying that it will not allow any Western troops in Ukraine, and I think they've broadly said as well they won't go along with any security guarantees that prevent Russia from renewing its invasion at some point. They'll fundamentally block that. And make sure that Ukraine, while Ukraine needs security guarantees, Russia is pushing for insecurity guarantees, so to speak. They want to make sure that Ukraine is not secure, that Ukraine is disarmed. They want to see the Ukrainian military reduced in size significantly. There's been talk from the Russians of limiting the amount of weapons and the categories of weapons that Ukraine can have. They want to see Ukraine prevented from having international allies, from having any foreign troops in Ukraine, and having even receiving Western weapons. And of course, with the Donbass, they're essentially saying that Ukraine has to hand over its most important fortifications. So the Russian vision for a post-war Ukraine is of a disarmed and defenseless Ukraine. Now, that is very clear, I think, or you don't need to be overly cynical, I think, to anticipate what Russia plans to do once Ukraine is disarmed and left defenseless in this manner. So I don't know whether there's going to be any sort of progress in talks about sending Western troops to Ukraine, be they coalition of the willing or any other format of troops. I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think the best that the Ukrainians can hope for really here is that the Russians will say no, and then that will force the Trump administration to say, okay, listen, this is not working. This win-win scenario, this compromise piece is just not working. We need to take a different tack here, and we need to apply more pressure on the Russians. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Because frankly, we're just going around in circles here, and all these different negotiations between the British and the French and the Germans, and then the Ukrainians and the Americans, it's kind of redundant because ultimately, when they bring it to the Russians will just say no.
Mr. Toff, concerning the frozen Russian assets now, if the European Union fails in Brussels to unlock the 210 billion euros from frozen Russian assets, how do you think the US would react? Will Washington step in, or will it just walk away?
Yeah, honey, unfortunately, I don't think Washington is going to step in. And that's a failure of my country because they should. We shouldn't be at this point in time. So any criticism that I have towards our European allies bears that in mind, that the U.S. is the one failing here. We're failing Europe, we're failing Ukraine in terms of our response. But having said that, Europe, one way or the other, has to find a way to get this funded. As I said on a weekly show that we do in Ukraine with my colleague Colonel John Sweet and I, that we write together, is that it's time for Europe to stop fearing Putin. Look, this is a guy that is very good at setting conditions in the media as though he's winning on the battlefield in Ukraine. He's only making marginal gains at a foot's pace at that. He's losing 80 some odd soldiers a day, according to the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. This is not a guy who's going to be able to invade Western Europe anytime soon. He may have that designs down the line, but he doesn't have the capacity to do that now. For Belgium to throw up these legality issues about getting sued afterwards, look, indemnify them, give them what they need, but move on and get it funded, because the economic needs of Ukraine are very real. They are facing a cash crunch if they don't get it. But if the EU gets wrapped up inside of itself and can't, then you have to have a coalition of the willing, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and others, that gets the funding that Ukraine needs, because I doubt that it's coming from Washington anytime soon. And I'd only end that I think stopping fearing Putin, one of the ways to send a signal in these negotiations to change Putin's cost calculus here is Europe needs to get bold right here. I wish the U.S. were getting bold with them. That's just not happening. Implement a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. Stop the drones from encouraging not only that part of the country, helping protect their energy grid and their civilians from Putin's intentional attacks, but also, defending their own flanks. We've seen these overflights in Romania, in Poland, as well as in Estonia. Put a stop to it. Europe can draw a line in the sand. Putin can't react. He doesn't have the air power capacity to go against NATO-like aircraft, if you will, from these countries. It's something that's doable. The Europeans just need to stop fearing Putin and get it done. But I doubt that happens, unfortunately, at least anytime soon.
Mr. Dickinson, now about the Ukrainian administration. Given the corruption scandal shaking Zelensky's inner circle, is public trust strong enough to sustain painful peace choices?
Well, I think Zelensky will face a lot of difficulty going for re-election if he survives the war and then makes it through to the post-war era. But as long as the war continues, I don't really see it as much of an issue. Ukrainians are not fighting for Zelensky. They're not fighting for the regime. I think this is one of the mistakes that the Russians make often, that they think if only we could get rid of Zelensky, everything would be okay. That's a complete misreading of the situation. Ukrainians are fighting for national survival. They're fighting for their country, and they're fighting for each other. Essentially, they're fighting for their homes. So Zelensky's role here is as the point man, the representative, the man who's going into negotiations. But he has to represent the country in ways that reflect public opinion. So he can't make a very, very unpopular move. If he tried to make a particularly unpopular move, for example, if he said, "Okay, I'm giving away, X amount of land, be it the Donbass or wherever," there would be a huge backlash, and quite likely he would not. He could easily be removed from power. Or he could just be, the military or others would simply refuse to go along with his orders. So, he's not all powerful by any means. He has to take public opinion into consideration. And Ukrainians have very clear, I think, clear red lines of what is and isn't acceptable. They understand, this country's made enormous sacrifices. They've suffered terribly. And while they're exhausted, they don't want those sacrifices to be in vain. They want to keep going, and they want to make sure they get a peace that is, they understand they're not going to get the whole country back in terms of its 1991 borders, but they do want a peace that is credible and that is sustainable.
Mr. Peter Dickinson, the expert at Atlas Center for Studies, and Mr. Mark Todd, the national security and foreign policy expert. Gentlemen, thank you both for your insights and your valuable discussion. As diplomacy races against time, the world holds its breath. Will peace emerge from principle, or be forged a compromise that reshapes Europe's order forever? That's all the time we have for this episode of Think Tank. I'm Henny Safe. Thank you for joining us.